Hi, welcome to my altered base set card review, and this chapter being Axiom, Permanents, and Spells. The first spell we have coming out of Axiom is the Hooked spell. Target character switches expeditions. The main purpose of this spell is to... The biggest... I guess it's not the main purpose because this will probably fall back into its backup purposes like almost as much as its ideal purpose. But the ideal purpose is to move something from a biome that it's good at to a biome that it's bad at. And I'm noticing live that that is what they are trying to depict in the art, which is really, really cool and makes me excited about the set. So the little character in the art is really good at climbing mountains, but if you can see, the robot is going to yank them over to like a prairie where their mountain climbing stat is going to be irrelevant. So against polarized characters, this is a really situational way of removing a character for way less mana than those types of effects are usually available for. You can do it twice and it's still cheap the second time, but it's so hard to pull this off once that this would have a similar value if it was fleeting almost. It's tricky to find polarized characters because although there's lots of them in the card pool, people tend not to prefer them, and some of the factions that are doing the best don't have a lot of polarized characters. The Ortis faction actually has a color theme to not have many polarized stats. The developers have said that, and Ortis is one of the front runners for early deck building. For that reason, I'm going to give Hooked a C. Hooked also doesn't have any direct synergies with the most prominent heroes in Axiom in the first set, because it's not helping Traced, it's not a payoff for Traced, and Subash actually has the idea of spending only 1 mana to start progressing on wins down pat. So that also hurts it and keeps it from being more like a B. I would keep in mind that you don't have to run a full 3 copies of this, and running only 1 copy could let you mana zone it when you just know your opponent is Ortis, and then maybe keep it against Lyra. The rare version draws you 2 cards. This would be pretty nice if you were sure you would play it the second time, but I think the uncertainty that you will actually play it a second time, even if you found the first blowout play, means that this rare point spend is not attractive enough, because we're also not guaranteed to play it the first time. So we might fail to get 2 draws, we might fail to get even 1 draw. I think it makes far more sense to spend a rare point on the types of cards that reliably get involved in the game and give you your rare point back. So I'm going to give this one a D. And we lose some of the cheapness on the first play of the card, which was kind of exciting on the common. Boom. Sacrifice a character. If you do, discard target character or permanent. To look at the rare version, you can sacrifice a character or permanent. If you do, discard target character or permanent. It's a little bit easier to find a useless permanent than a useless character if you have the Axiom Scrambler card specifically. You can also occasionally find completely useless characters if you have a sleeping character that woke up in the wrong expedition, a sleeping character that's guaranteed to wake up in the long expedition later. You could go that early. You could also find simply a character that is not going to win its lane on the last turn of the game. Or I guess any character that has no hope of winning its lane if there's no way to use other characters to help it out. That's another way it can be free. I guess these are kind of the same concepts we had in the Linde Way discussions, but I always think about it for the first time in a new faction. I think being able to discard a character is a really important feature because it sabotages the card preemptively, and it can remove some of your opponent's best cards. It can remove cards like Unique Athenas and cards like Robin Hood that are devastating if they're played the second time, even if you were to remove them immediately. And this can also flexibly remove permanents. So I'm going to give this a B. I think you could find a way not to need to resort to these restrictions, the restriction of needing to have a character. So I won't give it an A because I can view it as not indispensable. However, I think whenever the preemptive sabotage plus remove effect is available to a faction, I really like the idea of having at least a little bit of it, because it deals with uniques so conclusively. And this is the double rarity trade where you're not even paying 1 rare point to get this. This is that common. The Ortis faction sometimes has to spend a rare point to get Banishing Gate if they're worried about those types of cards and permanents. And this is a very low deck building cost to have some of that in the range. I think all 3 characters have an easy enough time getting a small character to throw into this. But I might not run the full 3 copies when I try it. I will give Rare Boom a D and suggest that you probably play the common version. Even if Axiom Scrambler is maxed out in your list, you could just have games where you just don't play the Axiom Scrambler, and for that reason you're not able to sacrifice it, and you're not really getting the rare point out of here. Or you could even have a game where you did play the Axiom Scrambler, and you do play Boom while the Axiom Scrambler is out, but it happens you also have a character that has no hope of winning its lane at the same time, so the rare point still didn't do anything. So if we look at all the things that need to happen for this rare point spend to be effectual, it's actually pretty unreliable. Mechanical training. Activate the arrow triggers of target permanent you control. This is an incredible amount of restriction just to get a 3/3/3 if it's rare Brassbug Hive. A 1-cost 3/3/3 that goes into a 2-cost 3/3/3 is very, very above rate. But when you consider that you're being asked to hold this card in your hand for a very long time for a game state that may never occur, and then play that character into a high mana environment where those numbers aren't as decisive as they are earlier in the game, all those costs combine to the point where you should probably not actually be doing this. So I'm going to give this a D. And then we'll see if the rare changes our minds. Activate the triggers of up to 2 target permanents you control. This rate is a bit better if you look at the ratio of mana to the number of arrows you get, but the condition is becoming even more difficult to satisfy. This is asking us to have a lot of cards in our deck that are not characters, and every time you just corner yourself into not playing a character at all with high spell, high permanent decks, you just lose an advancement, and an advancement is often the very thing you're trying to do with a card like this. So this is still a D. And I think the core sets, we mentioned this in the character review, but the core sets layout of the best arrow trigger being on a 6-cost is a big part of being hesitant about these kinds of effects. Keylon Burst. Send to reserve target character with hand cost 4 or less, or discard target permanent with hand cost 4 or less. So when you use the Keylon Burst on a character with hand cost 4 or less, you're going down half a card relative to your opponent, because Keylon Burst is fleeting, and whatever you sent to reserve probably was not fleeting. However, if you are playing Trace and Rossum, You're drawing half cards all the time that your opponent is simply not drawing if they're not someone like Tracer, Awesome, or Rin. So in terms of attrition, you're probably fine to include this. And also when played from reserve, you kind of cheat the fleeting. The fleeting is, in a way, not there anymore. And Supash and Marmo, in the same way, kind of treat the fleeting as not there anymore when this gets into reserve the way it gets into reserve without being played. So really only Sierra has any issue with playing this. Trading it evenly into a 3 is going to be okay. It's going to hold its own. And then trading it up for a 4 is going to be exciting. It could win you a lane that you wouldn't have otherwise won. You can also remove a 2 that is punching above its weight class, like a Khadgar and Mage Dancer. And then being able to dismantle specific permanents that are important to your opponent is a really strong thing to have in a range. This is very good against the Lyra Festival, costing 3 instead of 4, like might be the case in some other decks. So this is going to be an A. I think this will usually make the cut. If it was 2 copies instead of 3, it wouldn't surprise me too much, because sometimes you run out of things to burst. But it's likely to be 3. This Keylon Burst costs more and creates a 2/2/2 robot token. Paying 1 more mana to get 2/2/2 more of stats is usually a good deal, but it's less of a good deal when it's stapled to a situational card like a Keylon Burst, because you are initially going to want to be able to play Keylon Burst when and where you want to. For instance, when opponents try to save their best characters towards the end of a turn, you might spend down to 3 mana before they show you their character that's really good to Keylon Burst. Such as a rare Coneman, for instance. And then if you've spent down to 3, you just simply can't remove it at all. So a 2/2/2 robot is not enough of a consolation prize when you play it the next turn on something tiny just so that you can play it. For that reason, I don't think this version of Keylon Burst is going to be the one you prefer. You also just don't even do the thing if you don't have 2 or more landmarks. I was actually already skeptical if you got it every time. I was misreading it a little bit. So this is definitely going to be a D. But this is the best one for the brass bug screenshots, probably. Brass bug hub. It has 3 little markers on it, and that's how many times you can pay 1 to create a 2/2/2 robot token. This card is pretty tricky to evaluate for me. The total amount of mana you spend for the points is 6 for 666, which is on rate, and then being able to split it up it should be convincing on its own. But the installment plan does have some awkwardness to it, where spending 3 all in one turn may mean that turn is an O2, whereas spending 1 to create a creature or a robot of this nominal size on the turns that you're getting advantage might be like a little bit of advantage, but not enough advantage to generate 2 O's, just enough advantage to really make your 1/1s secure. So if you never claw back that O2 you took to deploy this, then you could be in a tough spot. A way the brass bug hive gets used is to expect the strong, the way the brass bug hub, if I misspoke, often gets used is to reinforce the strong brass bug hive endgames with a ton of brass bugs, so that all brass bugs get +1/+1/+1. That is on the rare brass bug hive, is having something to get onto. It makes this 999 for 6. But I would prefer to use characters to do those things, I think. Or just use Supash and Marmo's face. I think that's a cool feature of Supash and Marmo's hero ability that you're able to leverage that without relying on a inconsistent card. So I'm going to give the Brassbug Hive a D, and then we'll look at the rare version. It costs 2. This makes it remarkably more likely that you stayed in the right spot on your lanes as you were putting this out. I wish you could use it immediately to help with that turn, but it's not necessarily going to help with that turn. Or it's definitely not going to help with that turn. You can't pay 1 to make the token until the next noon. There is kind of a shortage of permanent cards you can easily put into reserve pretty easily, and with Sebastian Marmo's ability, and then play for a benefit pretty easily. So I'm going to give this a C. If you put this into reserve with Sebastian Marmo's ability, and then find a spot where you can play it without losing an expedition you would have lost anyway, this can generate a lot of advantage, and a single rare Brassbug Hive could need this kind of support to take over the game later in the game. So I think this is an appealing option. It's something where I want to try decks with 3 of them and decks with 0 of them and see which ones work better. And Sebastian Marmo specifically. I think Chasen Rossum probably is not on board for this. And of course, funnily, Sierra and Oddball is upset the cost went down to 2 because she doesn't get her trigger unless it costs 3. Axiom Reprocessor. At noon, you resupply. This is one of my favorite pure draw cards in the set. I think I already said that during the Muna review. We get to review cards extra times in Altered. Even though you're only getting half a card each time, you're getting more diversity in your options at the same rate as drawing cards, generally. And 4 is kind of the same cost as 5 or 3 in terms of giving up on contesting the expeditions very well the turn you develop it. This is most appealing in Traced and Rossum. I think Sebastian, even though Sebastian Marmo tends to need cards because of losing so many cards, Sebastian Marmo can probably get by with just 2 or 3 draws and not the gazillion draws that this represents. But Traced and Rossum may catch up on the tempo lost by playing this almost immediately if it just gains 1 or 2 sooner rust counters, and then a special ability from reserve gets used quicker. I will give this card a C. I think I'm not immediately sold on losing the 2 expeditions to gain this card advantage. Instead of, I would default to choices like Ada Lovelace first. But this is one of the best rates we've seen on cards that look anything like this. And the way of trying to jump back into the game after getting set back by this, and Trace and Rossum specifically, is a little bit convincing. We'll give this one a D, because this is giving you 1 of something that you have way too much of for the rest of the game anytime you play this. I think there's no way to play this and not feel like you're very happy with getting a large number of resupplies for the rest of the game. Because in addition to all these cards you're resupplying, the ones that naturally go to your reserve are going to your reserve. So it's not worth the rare point. Keylon Cylinder. Keylon Cylinder charges up on some turns and then adds a boost on other turns. In practice, if you actually play with Keylon Cylinder, you tend to find that it it may miss up to a single boosting event because of the counter rule. Besides the turn it comes into play, it might miss the turn it comes in, and it might miss one other turn, and then besides that, it tends to get ahead on Keylon counters because there's so many turns you can completely give up on winning either lane that you just end up with extra Keylon counters. So you just charge it up instead of giving a boost to anyone. And then this ends up with like 5 Keylon counters on it, and you know you're never going to run out. At that point, you just always have a boost whenever you want. I guess this is the common version where you do have to be a little more committal, so that might happen a little bit. You might run out a little bit more with this version. But the main point is that on the surface, it's 2/3 of your turn you have a boost, but it is going to be at least a little better than 2/3 of your turn you have a boost. Because this is a permanent, Supassion, Marmo, and even Trace and Rossum can kind of cheat card economy using it because permanents played from reserve are the same as a full card. I generally think the flexibility of this boost and it happening for the rest of the game and not usually needing to lose an expedition to get this out makes this really appealing. So I'm going to give this an A. I'm a little biased by the print and play decks that really make this card seem really good. I think I could only be overestimating it, but I am still pretty excited about the card, even with this nerf to the way it was timed. In print and play, you could target it anywhere, and in this version, you have to play the character first to get the boost. This one does a boost coming in, and then it reverts to the print and play version where you can wait and see finish everything that you were going to do, hopefully see everything your opponent was going to do, and put the counter anywhere. Despite both of these benefits, I'm hesitant to spend this rare point. The 1/1/1 of stats is not as good as a 1/1/1 because you can't spread it to a lane you haven't participated in yet. So there will be a lot of times that this arrow boost does not flip any lanes. And then there will be enough games where the flexibility of targeting the boost does not change anything in any of the 5 turns you get to play with this, that I narrowly would prefer the common. However, it's very conceivable that the target ability does add up to something. So I will give this one a B, but I have a preference to play the common and save the rare point, of course. Keylonic Generator. You can pay 2 and exhaust it to draw a card. It is really important to have mana so that you can play cards with higher biome stats instead of the ones with lower biome stats that tend to appear on the cards that have lower costs. So you don't want to spend 2 to use this, so this is a D. That's a really simplistic way of putting it, but I think the numbers are so bad on this that it gets pretty straightforward. I think in an entirely different core set where card economy could have an entirely different value, maybe you could look at this very differently. But I think in the core set we got, the value of draw a card relative to mana is not anywhere near close to this card being good. If you actually napkin math like how much mana per card and the size of the installments that this is asking relative to the Axiom reprocessor, and then you try to account for how smaller increments of mana are easier to get away with, the Axiom reprocessor is just way better. And this version appreciates that smaller payments of mana are easier to get away with. It is just still not enough. This is still going to be a D. You can take the card you draw and put it into mana, which the Axiom reprocessor does not let you do. But you can never do that at a pace where you can just draw the card and see, oh, if only I had 1 mana, this card I just drew would help me not get O2'd for playing a Kelonic Generator recently instead of playing cool cards to my reserve. You can never do that. You can only set up your next turn. And for that reason, I think you're going to lose a lot of advancements, even if you're wisely investing these extra cards back into mana. It is a single card ramp engine and a certain way of winning the game. So it does give me pause, and I think a lot of cards in set 2 could make this the thing you want to do. And if something in set 2 could make this the thing you want to do, then an entirely wrong way of viewing set 1 could also make this the thing you want to do. But for now, I am giving it a D. Armored Jammer. Armored Jammer will sabotage, and then it just sits there as a permanent that has no meaning. As a permanent that has no meaning, if you have 3 or more permanents at dusk, you will probably pick it to discard. You can use the rare boom to get some kind of use out of this. You can race to having the 2 or more permanents conditioned faster because this is cheaper than permanents that do something over and over. I think, yeah, even the Brassbug Hub did something over and over up to 3 times. This is a little restrictive in when you can put it out. So if your opponent has nothing good to sabotage, but you want to turn on 3 little pigs, then you kind of have a catch-22 on whether to put this out or not. And this is a little bit unexciting for the idea of Supash and Marmo putting it into reserve and then playing it as a full card from reserve, because it doesn't draw a full card or create an entire card's worth of commitment to the board. So it's probably not really going to fully reverse an attrition battle if you use it that way in Supash and Marmo. This is a cheap and funny way to get the last rest counter for Trace and Rossum if you want to do the silly cell phone thing. I'm going to give this a D. I think that restriction, the catch-22 scenario I described, kind of disrupts the pitch of this card a little too much. So I would prefer to use a character to sabotage or see if I can get away with just not sabotaging. This is a D because the only way to get this out of the landmark zone without drawing a lot of landmarks is to use the boom. And I don't want to play 2 rares that I each dislike to justify each other. You can play a bunch of permanents to get this out of your landmark zone, but you're often already happy if you navigated to a position where you could play lots of permanents. So that seems like a double down to me, and I generally don't like double downs. I like when I can make fewer statements about what my draws are like and still be in a good position. The Foundry, Axiom Bastion. Cards played from reserve. Cards played from hand triggered just like if they were played from reserve. Trace and Rossum is incentivized to play a lot of support abilities, which means Trace and Rossum plays fewer cards with a from reserve trigger. So there's some tension there. Sebastian Marmo fits with this a little bit better, but I think Sebastian Marmo will actually already have his own deck building restriction where he's encouraged to play permanents. He's encouraged to play twos so that you can do 2+1 at the start of the turn, or at the start of the game. And he's encouraged to play cards that can be used repeatedly. I guess this does work with Athena, which I was excited about for him, but he doesn't need the help with Athena. He can just put it into reserve directly. Actually, that's a global issue here. Sebastian Marmo can just always put something into reserve directly if he wants this effect. So this is a D. It would only be good in Sierra, and even in Sierra, I think you would have a problem where you were including cards only because of Foundry, and then you didn't actually draw the Foundry that game and you felt bad. Draw a card when it comes in. Pay 1 more mana for the right, and it's a rare. This is significant. Well, it's not significantly worse than most rare upgrades, because like I've commented before, I think the difference between 3 and 4 mana permanents is deceptive. But this is only 1 card. Anyway, this won't move off of D because of the card. Brassbug Hive. I'm going to give this a D, and then we're going to look at the rare and say that we always play the rare, and the rare is an A. Rare Brassbug Hive has a much greater amount of value than common Brassbug Hive because every single robot that joined your expedition has a boost. This already justifies its cost on the Brassbugs you get every single noon for the rest of the game. But then other Brassbug Hives and any other effects that create robots are getting these boosts. So that further justifies the higher cost. And the difference between 5 and 6 can be similar to the difference between 3, 4, and 5 permanents, where you're just giving up on winning that turn anyway. It's a little bit more appreciable of a difference when you get to 6, because once you get to 6, 7, 8, you're starting to jeopardize your ability to have something useful to play on each of your manas. But 6 is not as difficult to accommodate as 7. Brassbug Hive is often a win condition for the faction because it offers an amount of scaling where you can get the amount of mana you have plus the amount of permanents you have. Like 1 Brassbug Hive and a good draw, or 2 Brassbug Hives and even crappy cards, or 1 Brassbug Hive and 1 Brassbug Hub and some average cards. All of those things can leverage just an amount of mana to just 2-0 an opponent with an opponent who's still drawing some of the best cards in their deck. And that's a strategy for winning the game. This gets hit hard by permanent removal. The upsides are just so high that we're willing to take that risk. And it does, the 2/2/2 robot you get immediately isn't big enough to keep you from getting 2-0'd if your opponent just plays characters and ignores this. But it is possibly big enough that if your opponent wants to remove this before you get the first noon trigger, that maybe they won't have enough mana to 2-0 you at the same time as removing this. So that's cool. It's kind of like a funky way of getting the... what was the defensive targeting ability in this game called? Tough. It's kind of like a Brassbug form of tough. You're threatening the Brassbug. Haven, Bravos Bastion. Your characters have gain 1 boost when played from reserve. This would be funny with Athena. I guess it has all your Athenas have +1/+1. In a lot of cases, you're playing cards from your hand. At least Sebastian Marmo is like playing Brassbugs from hand. But both Tristan Rossum and Sebastian Marmo do play a lot of characters from reserve. This is a bit better than the Brassbug Hub in a lot of ways because you're getting You're not spending any mana to get extra stats on the turns after you develop a two cost permanent. The resupply is also appealing. It does kind of whiff if you put a permanent or a spell into your reserve, and that's the thing that was exciting to put into reserve with either Traced or Supash's ability. I will give this a B. I think this is offering enough permanent advantage at a cheap enough cost that I'm interested. But it doesn't front load the points as much as perhaps Sebastian Marmo would like to do to end the game before he runs out of cards. And Sebastian Marmo was my preference. I guess it's harder to think about Trace and Rossum. Trace and Rossum may just love this because the resupply may hit a support ability, and then this is just a lot of extra benefit on future turns for potentially only getting 1/1. Ouroboros Lyra Bastion. If you would resupply, instead reveal the top 2 cards of your deck, put one in reserve, discard the other. This is a D because this is 0 biome stats for a 3. I think you really don't want to be doing that. You can probably get bonus biome stats every time you resupply a unique this way that you would have missed, but you wouldn't. It's only a coin flip that you would have missed. Maybe it would have been on top if you hadn't played this at all. It's only when the second one is the good card that it even does anything, and it's per the resupply you do. It gives you 1 resupply when you play it, but that's like a little kicker. It's a little bit insubstantial. I think this is not very good, and your deck would be full to the brim with the Brassbug Hubs and the Haven Bravos Bastions before you would get to the chance to consider this in terms of permanent advantages. Harvest. Resupply, and then for 2, resupply. This is not good. It is better to pick some of the cards that draw cards or resupply in a way that is providing biome stats at the same time, instead of possibly having a 2-cost 0/0/0 resupply. Teamwork training. This can remove small characters, but we can already do that with the Keylon Burst. This is saving a little bit of mana off the Keylon Burst, but I think if we found out that we were mana sensitive, we would be likely to play the Hooked card. I can't think of any small characters that would be crucial to reserve that are doing something that's mean no matter which expedition they're in. So I'm going to give this a D. I don't think this is one of the ones you're interested in. Sticky Note Seals. You can discard a high-cost permanent, or you can send a high-cost character to reserve. I think I like the boom spell to do the things this card does better than this, because although the boom spell has this conditionality to it and some restrictions on how it could be used, anytime the character you're moving costs 5, and I say 5 because you already have a spell that hits 4, so it only starts to be at 5 when you weren't reaching these numbers without a rare point. If you're using boom on something that costed 5, the difference in the size of the thing you're hitting and the thing you had to pay is probably big enough to do okay on lanes. So I think we're going to be able to save rare points if we leverage the Keylon Burst and the boom. and don't dip into the sticky note seals. So this will be a D. Open the gates. Create a 2/2/2 robot token in each of your expeditions. So this is 4/4/4 of stats on turn 2. And again on turn 3 if you'd like. And it scales with the Ogun card, and it scales with the rare Brassbug Hive. I think there is ways to do these things at common, so we're not really going to need this. This is also very bad to add to reserve. Not very bad, but very bad relative to the other things that are happening in Axiom. To pay more the second time you play it from reserve. So this will be a D. Kraken's Wrath. Send to reserve up to 4 target characters with total hand cost 6 or less. So it's going to be very difficult to wait for your opponent to play all the characters you would like to remove with this. I went over this at length the last time I reviewed Kraken's Wrath. But the priority system means we need to play lots of 1s and 2s to be able to do this and actually hit a ton of our opponent's characters, assuming they didn't use something like Sleeper Anchored. And it's worth noting that this is even harder to do in Subash and Marmo if you elected to use the ability that particular turn, because you don't pass priority when you use the ability. I'll give Kraken's Wrath a D. Trace and Rossum would be a little more likely to use it because you can put it into reserve with the ability and maybe wait a while to use it. And that takes us back to Hooked. Let me see if there's an additional page. There's an additional page. That's the additional page cards we already reviewed. Okay, we reviewed everything. Thank you for watching the video. Some of these Ds were very different levels of intensity for how disinterested or skeptical or hesitant I am about them. But I did choose only 4 grades when I started doing this because it lets me grade cards a little bit faster. So keep in mind some of these Ds have pretty high hopes, and then some of these Ds are just it's utterly inconceivable to me that they will be played before we get set 2 to change our minds about them. So they're not all exactly the same. The comment has come up in a couple of videos, but especially in this one, I think. So we only have one more faction to review, and that's going to be Lyra, which is actually my favorite faction, and it is also the faction that struggles the most in the starter deck format, which is one of the most widely available formats before the game came out. So it is going to be fun to try to change our minds about Lyra. I hope you watch those videos too. Bye!